Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great works of classic English literature into gripping radio. Today we're bringing you the third and final part of The Star, a brilliant early work of science fiction by H.G. Wells. In this harrowing tale, a massive rogue planet has struck the gas giant Neptune, the titanic collision knocking the planet out of its orbit and leaving it falling incandescent toward the inner solar system and the sun. At first, this cosmic calamity resulted in nothing more, as far as the inhabitants of the Earth were concerned, than the sudden appearance of a beautiful new star in the night sky. But as the course of the burning ruin of what was once Neptune is thrust into a new trajectory by the influence of Jupiter, the mathematicians and scientists of the world were reduced to terror by their awful new knowledge that the new star would either impact directly or pass very close by the Earth, and that either outcome signaled unspeakable atrocity and the death of most or all of mankind. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, and brighter, until it had turned night into a second day. Had it come straight to the Earth instead of on a curved path, had it lost no velocity to Jupiter, it might have leapt the intervening gulf in a day. But as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come to our planet. The next night, it had become a third the size of the moon before it set to English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America near the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at, and hot. And a breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength, and in Virginia and Brazil and down the St. Lawrence Valley it shone intermittently through a driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violent lightning, and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba was a thaw and devastating floods, and upon all the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and the bodies of beasts and men, they rose steadily in the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying populations of their valleys. And along the coast of Argentina and up the South Atlantic, the tides were higher than had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters, in many cases scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities. And so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America, from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn, hillsides were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. The whole side of Cotopaxi slipped out in one vast convulsion, and a tumult of lava poured out so high and broad and swift and liquid that in one day it reached the sea. So the star, with the wan moon in its wake, marched across the Pacific, trailed the thunderstorms like the hem of a robe, and the growing tidal wave that toiled beneath it, frothing and eager, poured over island and swept them clear of men, until that wave came at last, in a blinding light and with the breath of a furnace. Swift and terrible it came, a wall of water 50 feet high, roaring hungrily upon the long coasts of Asia, and swept inland across the plains of China. For a space the star, hotter now and larger and brighter than the sun in its strength, showed with pitiless brilliance the wide and populous country, towns and villages with their pagodas and trees, roads, wide cultivated fields, millions of sleepless people staring in helpless terror at the incandescent sky, and then, low and growing, came the murmur of the flood. And thus it was with millions that night, a flight no whither, with limbs heavy with heat and breath fierce and scant, and the flood like a wall swift and white behind, and then death. China was lit glowing white. But over Japan and Java and all the islands of Eastern Asia, the great star was a ball of dull red fire because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above was the lava, hot gases and ash, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with the earthquake shocks. Soon, the immemorial snows of Tibet and the Himalayas were melting and pouring down by 10 million deepening, converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungles were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters around the stems were dark objects that still struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And in a rudderless confusion, a multitude of men and women fled down the broad riverways to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter, and brighter with a terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the whirling steam rose in ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships. And then came a wonder. Over Asia, it was as if the star had begun to fall behind the movement of the sky, and then, suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plain of India from the mouth of the Indus to the mouth of the Ganges was a shallow waste of shining water that night, out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills black with people. Every minaret was a clustering mass of people who fell one by one into the turbid waters as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there crept a shadow across that furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind, and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men, looking up near blinded at the star, saw that a black disk was creeping across its light. It was the moon, coming between the star and the earth. And even as men cried to God at this respite, out of the east, with a strange and inexplicable swiftness, sprang the sun. And then star, sun, and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was that presently, to the European watchers, star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space, and then slower, and at last came to rest. Star and sun merged into one glare of flame at the zenith of the day. The moon no longer eclipsed the star, but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky. And though those who were still alive regarded it for the most part with the dull stupidity that hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender, there were still men who could perceive the meaning of these signs. Star and earth had been at their nearest, had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding, swifter and swifter, in the last stage of its headlong journey downward into the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment around the world. All over the earth was such a downpour of rain as men had never seen before. And where the volcanoes flared red against the cloud canopy, there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud-silted ruins, and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach with all that had floated, and the dead bodies of the men and the brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling huge dikes, and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and the heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships as had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered, and sounding their way cautiously through new marks and shoals at once familiar ports. And as the storms subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon shrunk to 1/3 of its former size, took now 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, of the saving of laws and books and machines, of the strange change that had come over Iceland and Greenland, and the shores of Baffin's Bay, so that the sailors coming there presently found them green and gracious, and could scarce believe their eyes. This story does not tell. Nor of the movement of mankind now that the earth was hotter, northward and southward towards the poles of the earth. It concerns itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. And so we come to the end of this harrowing tale. The planet the star has left behind is not the one that existed before its passage, but there is renewal too, and hope as well in the narrator's final words. We hope that you've enjoyed this special compilation broadcast of BeFM Drama.